Yugoslavia, a country that was united after World War II, largely around the charisma and leadership of Tito. And we're going to consider Yugoslavia as a potential third way within the greater communist bloc, and we're going to examine some of the tensions that ultimately lead to the demise of a unified Yugoslavia. So during the Cold War, after World War II, you had the communist bloc and their Warsaw Pact allies that was dominated by the Soviet Union, and of course you had the Western Bloc and the NATO states that was dominated by the United States. Um, but a lot of folks forget that during the Cold War, there was also a very significant global movement called the Non-Aligned Movement that was made up of countries that really formed their policy around the basis of not siding with either side, um, not joining the Soviet bloc or not joining the Western Bloc. And Yugoslavia, Egypt, and India were typically at the core of this so-called non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement still exists today. It generally encompasses the participation of the developing world. Um, but during the Cold War, these states very much played the West and the East off against one another, seeking to manipulate those sort of tensions to their own benefit. And so we see with Yugoslavia, a country that receives a tremendous amount of military supplies from the Soviet Union, but also does a lot of economic trade and so forth with the West. In the 1980s, of course, um, the sales of the so-called Yugo car was an example of the involvement of Yugoslavia in the economics and trade of the Western world. So the non-aligned movement was really a movement that saw developing world countries seek to use their position advantageously by not aligning with the U.S. bloc or with the Soviet bloc, and instead sort of use their position advantageously in playing the two competing world powers sort of off against one another. Here you see a map that shows you a map of Europe. This is a modern map of Europe with Yugoslavia um, depicted in the red, which of course today is made up of several different nations, including Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia, um, and so forth. Yugoslavia is sometimes referred to as the land of South Slavs. It's made up of Serbians, Croatians, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, and Montenegrins. And this is very important because um, Yugoslavia is really a very multi-ethnic, diverse place. It is a place that was um, for many years a crossroads between competing forces from the Islamic world and also from the European world. For example, many people within Yugoslavia would use the Cyrillic alphabet and very much identify as like Slavic brothers of countries like Russia, for example. In fact, World War One began in Yugoslavia over the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated in the city of Sarajevo, which is today in Bosnia. Serbians had a relationship with the Russian Tsar's government the Tsarist Russian government at the time, and the Russians very much saw themselves as sort of cousins to the Slavic Serbians in the south. And it was here that Austria-Hungary would, of course, declare war on Serbia, and Russia would declare war on Austria-Hungary, coming to the aid of Serbia. So many Serbians identified with, the larger Slavic world. But there's also, of course, a great influence of the Islamic Ottoman Empire in Yugoslavian area. Bosnians are largely Muslim, and And this comes from the influence, the long-term influence of the Ottoman Empire that controlled much of southeastern Europe for hundreds of years before the Ottoman Empire fell apart following the First World War. Of course, there's also Catholics um, in Yugoslavia, particularly in areas north towards Italy. So in Yugoslavia, you find a very multi-ethnic. You find Orthodox Christians, you find some Catholic Christians, and you also find Muslims. So it's a very diverse population with, different languages, different cultural practices, and different religions. So during World War II, the Nazis, prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany would invade Yugoslavia. They also invaded Greece. To the east of Yugoslavia, sits Romania, and Romania had aligned with the Nazis. And of course, Romanians would participate in operations in the Eastern Front, including the Battle of Stalingrad. But the Yugoslavians, as well as the Greeks, refused to capitulate to Nazi demands. And the result was that prior to Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany invaded both Yugoslavia and Greece. And in the case of Yugoslavia, Greece fell in a matter of, I think, 4 weeks. In the case of Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia was conquered by the Nazis, and the Nazis launched, through the Luftwaffe, the Nazis launched very destructive air raids against Yugoslavian cities. But ultimately, the Yugoslavians, though conquered in the short term, would launch and wage a long-term resistance, a multi-ethnic local insurgency led to a large degree by communist partisan fighters against Nazi occupiers. And eventually, at the end of the war, liberation is led by Josip Broz Tito, Tito pictured here, who following the end of World War II would for the next 35 years really become the cult of personality of the Yugoslavian state. Yugoslavia will be established as a socialist republic, and it's really the charisma and leadership of Tito that sort of held it all together for the next 35 years. But of course, it wasn't simply Tito. Individuals like Stjepan Stevo Filipovic, who's pictured here, was one of the foremost partisan fighters against the Nazis. Here he's pictured prior to his execution, likely yelling something like "death to fascists." Filipovic was one of many who participated in a multi-ethnic local insurgency. And so it's important to note that unification in Yugoslavia was not simply about Tito, but it was also rooted in the fact that during World War II there was a common grievance that united people, that crossed the boundaries, if you will, of cultural, linguistic, and ethnic difference, and created a common grievance that created some of the groundwork for a united Yugoslavian Socialist Republic, which of course would exist for almost a half century following the end of World War II. After the end of World War II, the big question is, what's next? Would Yugoslavia pursue a free market capitalism like that of the United States, or would they pursue a Stalinist type central planning? And Yugoslavia, of course, will become a socialist state, but it's one that chooses a very unique path. And of course, there were multiple different ways within the Soviet Empire, though Yugoslavia is not in the Soviet Empire, of course, but there's multiple different ways that communist states sought to organize themselves. And Yugoslavia kind of created a unique path. Instead of the sort of socialist Stalinist central planning, Yugoslavia created a workers' socialism, something called workers' self-management. And here below, you see, of course, Sarajevo, which is an ancient crossroads city located today in Bosnia. And of course, this was where the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, sparking the First World War. He was assassinated on June 28th, 1914. So an incredibly significant place, and I just thought I would give you a look at the geography of modern-day Sarajevo, today located in Bosnia, the country of Bosnia. So Stalinist socialism is something that's centered around central planning from the government, from a Politburo, planning of the economy, state-owned factories, and forced collectivization of agriculture. By contrast, in Yugoslavia, workers' self-management centered around a decentralization of the economy and workers' ownership of factories, as well as private ownership in agriculture. So you have privatization on certain areas. You have local oversight of aspects of the economy, and you have workers owning and operating the factories, sort of like cooperatives, if you will, which was very, very different from the Stalinist model, which was centered around the Politburo, central planning from the Politburo, state-owned factories and forced collectivization. Yugoslavia does not choose this path, and for many years, I think you could strongly argue that it was much, much more harmonious and productive for Yugoslavians to pursue this third way of workers' self-management. And pictured below here, of course, I have an example, probably the preeminent example of Yugoslavian manufacturing, a Yugo, the car that became identified with a Yugoslavian manufacturer. It was originally based on a Fiat design, but it was a truly Yugoslavian, in many respects, a Yugoslavian manufactured car, and was sold to the West in huge numbers. Ultimately, of course, it was associated with being a rather subpar car that became a bit of a joke in the United States in the late 80s. But nonetheless, an example of Yugoslavian manufacturing and of Yugoslavia's place as an international economic partner, despite being a communist state. So it is very important to note, as I just mentioned, that Yugoslavia is not a democracy. It is a communist state. It's a non-aligned communist state. Tito and Stalin formally split in 1948, and Tito increasingly, through a cult of personality, sought to create sort of a unique third way in which Yugoslavia created a unique communist state that was not part of the Warsaw Pact, was not part of the Soviet Union in any way, but traded with the Soviet Union, but also was engaged with and traded with the West. And in this respect, Yugoslavia really demonstrates that the Cold War did perhaps not need to be as bipolar as it was. But it wasn't a democracy. It was very much driven by the Communist Party and of course, the charismatic cult of personality of Tito was really the thing at the core of Yugoslavian state. Yugoslavia was neutral in international relations, together with countries like India and Egypt, as well as other nations. It was at the core of the Nonaligned Movement. It received a lot of financial support from the West, who provided loans. It received much in the way of weaponry from the East, hence why many of the leftover weapons from the destructive wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s were, of course, weapons like AK-47s. They believed in open borders within Yugoslavia. There was freedom of movement within the country. It became a very popular attraction with respect to tourism as well. And these were sort of some of the key features that made Titoism under Yugoslavia sort of unique. A country that had this sort of communist cult of personality, a one-party state, a non-democracy, but yet a state that played the East and the West off against one another and took benefits from both. I want to show you just a couple of pictures from this period of the Cold War and the non-aligned movement. Here, of course, you see Tito with John F. Kennedy. You also here see Tito with Nikita Khrushchev. Yet again, images that symbolize Tito's ability to work with both sides, to work with the West, to work with the Soviet Union, but to not necessarily be wedded completely to one or the other, which is one of the things that makes Yugoslavia a very unique case, a unique third way in the history of the Cold War. In 1945, and I want to show you this slide just to give you an idea of just how far Tito took Yugoslavia. While we can certainly criticize the fact that he was, it was a one-party state, we can maybe criticize the fact that he used a cult of personality. The reality was that Yugoslavia advanced tremendously between 1945 and 1980. In 1945, the country was economically backward. There was almost no industry. It was dominated by agriculture. There were tremendous amounts of internal antagonisms centered around nationality, around religion, and around language, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. By 1980, Yugoslavia had undertaken 4 decades of urbanization and industrialization. It had become a modern nation in a lot of respects that produced products that, like the Yugo, were sold all over the world. They had created a working class consciousness that had, to a large degree, but not entirely, replaced some of the internal ethnic divisions that had previously dominated this area, which, of course, as I mentioned, was a crossroads and very much a battleground at times of competing forces. The forces of the Ottomans in Islam, the forces of Orthodoxy and of the Slavic movements, and also, of course, of the interest of, long ago, the interest of the old Holy Roman Empire, the influence of the Austrians as well in this area. So it had been a crossroads, and that had created many, many multifaceted realities in Yugoslavia. But by 1980, a lot of these had been, to some degree, pushed to the side in favor of a working class consciousness and a unified country. Of course, following the death of Tito in 1980, the country was unable to hold together. Those sort of ethnic divisions were exacerbated by certain political personalities, like, for example, Slobodan Milosevic, who, of course, would die in 2006 while in The Hague during a lengthy war crimes tribunal. Slobodan Milosevic was, of course, the Serbian leader who very much sought to make Serbia the sort of dominant power in the region at the expense of many, many other people. And of course, he was charged with instigating war crimes and genocide in places like Bosnia. But after Tito's death, the country generally disintegrates. There's no central leadership in the country. Over time, they tried to create a kind of power sharing system whereby effectively a president had to come from a different country every time around. And this created a sort of lack of stability in leadership, a lack of direction in leadership. And in addition, you see a rise of nationalism, in many cases economic collapse. And in the early 1990s, of course, Yugoslavia falls apart amid a very bloody and destructive civil war. You see the demise of the workers' self-management system, and eventually in very destructive conflict, particularly for those that faced ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, as well as those in Kosovo. We see a very, very bloody and destructive conflict, and of course this is one that the West would become involved in. The United States, of course, under the leadership of Bill Clinton, launched airstrikes during the Civil War. And ultimately, this leads to, again, the Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, infamously being imprisoned and charged with war crimes. He would, face a lengthy trial in The Hague, and he would die. The trial never was truly completed. He would die from a heart attack in 2006 while in prison. The result was the creation of 6 new nation states, the nation of Serbia, of Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and of course Montenegro. Today, Balkanization, this area is generally referred to as the Balkans. Balkanization has come to be an adjective that refers to the process of major countries sort of fragmenting into smaller national states. And usually Balkanization is considered to be more of a negative description because generally speaking, most regard the collapse of Yugoslavia as something that has ultimately weakened the situation for the various national identities and the different peoples within the old Yugoslavia as a singular unified Yugoslavia certainly had a much greater power internationally and economically together than they did as they have broken into 6 small nation states. So today, balkanization generally refers to the process of larger countries fragmenting into smaller countries. And in the case of Yugoslavia, this fragmentation came in a very bloody civil war that involved, again, ethnic cleansing. In the case of Bosnia, ethnic cleansing that involved, Christian groups targeting Muslims, and of course, also various types of crimes committed against the people of Kosovo as well, which today is yet to be an internationally recognized state. All right, guys, I hope this is helpful. Let's have a great week.